So, Dorothy, why don't we start by your telling us a little bit about your background? I mean, your childhood and your where you grew up and what you were interested in, and the things that you think might help in giving us an idea how you ended up being a writer.
Well, I was born in Sussex, New Jersey, but grew up in a small town outside Paterson called Totowa Borough. And I started reading at a very early age. And from reading, I thought, I can write this too. So I started writing stories when I was about 11 and able to put coherent paragraphs on a page. The first full novel I remember reading was Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And from there, I went to anything that I could get my hands on. My father left when I was 10 years old, and my brothers were, 4 and 18 months. I didn't see him pretty much after that at all, ever. So my mother brought us up. And, she had to go to work, so she wasn't home very often, and I was home taking care of my brothers, doing my homework and all that other stuff that kids do. But, I loved it. I didn't have a problem with it. It was just, that was our family. That's what we did.
What sort of work did your mom do?
She was a saleswoman at a company called Two Guys from Harrison, and she was in the linen department. I always had great sheets. The stories I liked to write involved all my friends, and we had adventures, and sometimes they were horror stories, and sometimes they were ghost stories, and sometimes they were just adventure stories. And we couldn't copy them off, so I'd have to read them to my friends, once I had handwritten them. But it was a lot of fun, and they would provide extra dialogue for me. I would just put my own ideas down on the page. My aunt asked me not all that long ago, were you surprised that you became a writer? And I said, absolutely not. I always knew I was going to be a writer of one kind or another. I thought novels at the beginning. I thought I'll be writing short stories and novels. In high school, I majored in business, secretarial, and I did the same thing when I went to college at Fairleigh Dickinson University. It was a 2-year AA course for executive secretarial, and we took things like business law and economics and accounting and the usual secretarial things, shorthand, typing, what have you. So where did my writing come in? I was always still writing on the side, and I also did some work for our college newspaper. My mother was always a practical woman and said, you can write all you want, but have a background that will let you earn money. So I thought that was the easiest thing for me to do, and I did it. I was, again, an honors student. I was positive I was going to be a novelist, and that was the kind of thing I was writing. Even in high school, I started a novel and was developing that in college. I just knew that I could earn my living as a secretary simply because I had started at 16 working part-time in an office in Paterson, New Jersey, and I was earning extra money to pay for my books and things, when I went to school, my labs and what have you. And I was perfectly positive I had no problem getting a job as a secretary, and I could write on the side. I would be a novelist eventually.
Mm-hmm. So you got your AA,
Mm-hmm.
and then did you go on to another school after that, or that was it for college? Was the AA it?
The AA was it for college for me simply because I really wanted to get out of school and get to work. My teachers wanted me to go another 2 years and get a teaching credential, and I did not wish to at that time. So what I did was I looked in the New York newspapers because I felt I would like to work there, and I saw an advertisement for a junior secretary at Screen Gems, which was the television arm of Columbia Pictures. And I was persistent. I interviewed 3 times, and they said, we hired you because you have good skills, but you wanted to work for us. You kept coming back. And it turned out I was junior secretary to Ralph Cohn, who was the president of Screen Gems. So for 2 months, I worked and went into New York, and then he died of a heart attack suddenly, and I was out of a job. So I came back to New Jersey and worked a little bit longer until approximately September of 1959, when I decided to go to California. And I told my mother, I'm going to take 2 weeks. If I find a job, I'll stay. And if I don't find a job, I'll have had a 2-week California vacation. And I came out here and I applied at various studios and wound up in the typing pool at what was then Revue Studios. In New York, in the president's office of Screen Gems, I was seeing scripts come across our desks, and they were for the various shows that they had on the air at the time, and I thought, I can write this, like so many fools before me. But seriously, I thought, I can do this. I know how to put a story together. I'd watched television for years and years and kind of got the idea of how stories were structured. And so I thought, I can do this. So when I had the opportunity to come out to California, I said, I'm going to try for a job there and see if I can't get into that screenwriting stuff, television writing stuff. Television was first on my mind, actually. And I landed a job at Revue, which was primarily television at that time. Of course, we were on the Universal lot where they were doing movies like Spartacus at the moment, but it was really an exciting time to be there.
So were you a watcher of television?
Oh, yes. Yes.
What were some of the shows you watched back when you were young?
Oh, golly. Every Western that was on the air at the time, of course, and there were many. And there were entertainment shows that we would watch, but primarily I liked dramas.
Can you remember the names of any of them that you were?
Well, let's see. There
particularly
was Zane Grey Theater. There was GE Theater. There was, I think, before I came out here, there was Playhouse 90. And a lot of the Westerns, there were Maverick was on, and Gunsmoke was on, and Wagon Train was on, and and I always loved Westerns too. I had been a Western fan of movies when I was growing up, so that intrigued me. And yes, I always watched television. My mother moved out here and bought a house. She was living next to Bob Steele, the old Western star who did Billy the Kid, many movies of Billy the Kid, and of course he wound up being the old trooper in F Troop. So he was my mother's next door neighbor for a time. And so I did see all those movies when I was a kid. And there was the Red Ryder serial with Little Beaver, who was Bobby Blake, and things like that. There were so many movies. We went to see movies all the time. There were Doris Day movies. There were just wonderful ones that you're enthralled all the time.
What
And
about
that
Roy
time,
Rogers and Gene Autry and those kind of
oh
movies?
yeah, all of those. Yeah, but they were on television as well as making movies, so you got a double bill there.
What was it you liked about Westerns?
I don't know, they just intrigued me. I always was into Westerns. I loved that idea of Western history. I liked it when we studied it in school, and I was always very interested in history. I'm a big biography, history fan, and I read a lot in those areas. I just always liked the adventure of those stories and action. That appealed to me. The fact that fairly often there was a woman around who wasn't helpless. That was always nice. In a lot of the movies, you had a stalwart woman who didn't run screaming away from whatever was coming at her. I always liked that.
You did.
I do.
You
Still do.
I know. I would guess you still do, but you even then you noticed that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I knew women were a big part, for instance, of opening the West. There are always women there. Whether they came forward from the background was another story, and those are stories I liked and wanted to tell.
You were working at Revue in what department?
It was the typing pool, but I was only there for a few months. When I saw an ad on the board for a producer's secretary, and I went and interviewed for it and got the job. And that was for Samuel A. Peoples, who was the producer creator, and Frank Price, who was the associate producer on a series called Overland Trail, which starred William Bendix and Doug McClure. As the producer's secretary and also the associate producer's secretary, I had to type up scripts. I had to type revisions that they either dictated or handed me handwritten. I had to answer the phones, obviously. I had to type up cast lists, shooting schedules, those kinds of things that any producer's office is going to handle. And in the meantime, I kept thinking about Overland Trail. And I liked the series. It was short-lived, but it was kind of fun. And I came up with an idea for it. And I went into Mr. Peoples' office and said, "Can I tell you a story?" And he said, "Okay." And he didn't like what I pitched, but he said, think more about that, because, he knew already that I liked to write, that I loved writing, that I loved the books and the scripts and everything. And he encouraged me. He said, think some more, and you bring me a good story, I will buy it. Then the 1960 writer's strike intervened, and we could only shoot what was already written and not do anything new. And during that time, we were kept busy. If we finished our production, then we had to be typing these lists and lists of stock shots out of the acquired RKO library for review. And that kept us busy until early June, I believe it was, in 1960, and the strike was finally ended. Both writer strikes and the Screen Actors Guild strikes, and everybody could go back to work. And The Tall Man now was up, and it was cast with Barry Sullivan and Clu Gulager, half-hour Western, And of course, I was now reading scripts for that Mr. Peoples or Frank Price were dictating to me or handing me to type up. And I said, I can do this. So I went into Mr. Peoples' office again and said, can I tell you a story? And he said, okay, if you tell me a good story, I will buy it. So I told him the major story for A Bounty for Billy, which was just bare bones, but he liked what was there. Remember, it was only a teaser and 2 acts then. And he said, all right, you have a writing assignment. So I was elated. I called my mother immediately. She wasn't out here yet. She was still back in New Jersey. And then I sat down to write it using the format that I already knew from the scripts and outlines I had read. So I had educated myself in that area. And I turned in the story, which he liked well enough, assigned it to a writer for teleplay purposes, and I had my first screen credit, and I became a member of the Writers Guild immediately.
Wow. Wow. How did it feel writing that first story?
It was great. It was great to write a story that I knew was going to be on. It wasn't one that was going to be shelved because he bought it out of, niceness or kindness. He wanted to do that story, and he did that story. So the next time I came into his office and said, I have a story, he said, okay, tell me the story. Told him the story. He liked it. I went out and wrote that one. And the third time I came in, I said, now I want to do a teleplay. And he said, okay, you've proven you can write. Let's see you do a teleplay. So I was given the assignment. It was not on spec. It was always, here's your contract. Now do the work. Mr. Peoples was always great that way. And he was my first mentor, really, because he would read and comment and say, okay, you missed this here. He gave good notes. You missed this. You need to do that. You need to punch this up. And he was extremely helpful at all times. So when I finished the teleplay for that third one, now I had a full screenplay credit for myself, story and teleplay by. And it was, at that time, Dorothy C. Fontana. My first 6 credits, basically, were Dorothy C. Fontana.
Tell us how old you were then.
I was 21 when I sold that first story. And in that same year, I sold the second story, the first teleplay, and then I sold another teleplay to Tall Man. And then I was given a rewrite assignment on Shotgun Slade. And now the Tall Man was over, and we were starting into another series, which was then called Frontier Circus. And I think that was John Derrick, and let me think if I can remember who the supporting actors were. I can't off the top of my head, I'm sorry. But it was exactly that. It was a story about a frontier circus moving from place to place. And this was now an hour. I hadn't written an hour. So I told Sam a story, and he said, okay, write that. And it was called Lipizzan. It was about the trained Lipizzan stallions that perform in circuses. And that, I only got the story credit, but it was my first hour credit. I was still working as a secretary during this time, so I was writing at home, obviously, after work and on weekends. And I still do it the same way. I write on a pad in longhand and draft it out. And then at the time, you typed it into a typewriter, and I was making changes as I went along. Oh, I can improve this dialogue, that kind of thing. And then I would take it out of the typewriter, read it again, make further changes, and finally turn it in. So usually what a producer is getting from me is approximately a third, sometimes even a fourth draft. That is called the first draft because that's the first one they get from me. I couldn't afford at those prices to not be working as a secretary. Remember, it was only approximately $2,500 for a half hour, and I think $3,500 for an hour at the time. So an hour story would have been about $1,000 roughly, if that. So yeah, I couldn't afford to stop working as a secretary, but I always found time to do the writing. The writing was never neglected because of my secretarial position. The secretarial position was never neglected because of the writing. I became a member of the Guild in June of 1960, and I don't think at that time there was even a welcoming committee or a briefing on how the Guild worked or anything. I pretty much had to learn that as I went along, and largely from Sam Peoples and Frank Price, who told me a lot about the Guild and how it worked. And they were very helpful on that because they were good Guild members. And I, always felt that I was a good Guild member. I was only what is now called an associate producer, a non-voting member, because I didn't have enough credits to become a voting member until much later. But I liked the Guild. I liked the idea of the Guild, what it stood for and what it fought for. And so I have been a Guild member since 1960 and a happy one. Freelance writing was very different then. It was almost all freelance writers. When you went in on a series to either pitch or to bring in a story that you had already concocted, you talked to maybe 3 people, sometimes only 2. on The Tall Man and the other series I've mentioned that Mr. Peoples was involved with, it was just Samuel A. Peoples and Frank Price. Those are who you talked to. If they liked the story, you got the script, you went home and you wrote it. And we had practically every script, except for a couple from Mr. Peoples and a couple from Frank Price, were written by outside writers. Always outside writers. And you always had outside directors. There was no staff director or anything like that. You always brought in your directors and you hired the writers as freelancers. And that went on for many, many years. Every series I have worked on, from that very beginning one to today, I've always talked with a few people, positions to buy, and they would say yes or no. And if it was yes, you went home and wrote it and brought it back. I have never worked as a staff writer per se in a room as they do it today. I have always worked with 2 or 3 people who were the executive producer, usually the producer, maybe the associate producer and or the story editor, or I have been the story editor or associate producer. And again, always worked with a lot of freelance people. Frank Price then was a writer. He was hired on by Samuel A. Peoples on Overland Trail and then Tall Man and Frontier Circus as the associate producer. His job was a lot of the story editor job today. But he was involved in production and casting and things like that. But it was not called story editor then, what he was doing. But he was a very refreshing man. He was always had a smile, always had a joke, and he was a lot of fun to work with. Mr. Peoples was more serious, but he could have a good time too. You know, he'd laugh at Frank's jokes, which was fine. It was such a small office. There were just the 3 of us really working on a series, and several series, in fact, in order. And it was just like a small family that worked together, and then you said good night, and you went home and you wrote, which was my job.
And Frank Price became?
Later he became the head of studio. It was either Columbia or Fox. I might have been both, but yes, he was the head of studio, and still around, still working as far as I know. One more time I started in a typing pool at MGM. Mm-hmm. Since I had come there with Sam Peoples, he was writing a movie. He finished the movie. He wanted to move on. I felt, well, I can find a job here at Metro. And they had a job in the typing pool one more time. So I was typing wonderful scripts, mostly for movies, which was interesting. And then there was a job on the board, history repeats itself, for a television show. Well, I already had television show secretary, credentials, so I went up and applied for it, and that was for Gene Roddenberry and former president of the Guild, Del Reisman, who was associate producer, on a show called The Lieutenant. It was an hour-long show, starred Gary Lockwood, and we did about 26 episodes, as I recall, in that 1963 into 1964. In fact, we were on The Lieutenant, and there was a cemetery scene in the rain being filmed out in our back lot when John Kennedy was shot. It was an amazing day that nobody who was alive at the time can ever forget. But I had been talking to our Marine Sergeant tech on the phone, I had a couple of tech questions I needed to have answered for a script someone was writing. And he said, I have to hang up, the president's been shot. And I went screaming into Gene's office saying, turn on the television, the president's been shot. And we just literally sat there all day in front of the television set watching everything unfold. And at the same time, as I said, ironically, on our back lot, the lieutenant was shooting a cemetery scene in a drizzling rain, which was so grim and everything. And the actors didn't know about it until somebody called a cut and the director told them. So it was one of those amazing days, But after The Lieutenant, Gene Roddenberry had a first look agreement with Arena Productions, which was the television arm of MGM at the time, and he showed them Star Trek, and they refused it. Now, how many times do you think they've kicked themselves around the block for turning down Star Trek? Desilu finally picked it up. I'm not sure who all turned it down. There were a couple of other studios, and CBS turned it down. NBC picked it up, and so I went to Desilu, which is now the Paramount lot, and we began. I was still a producer secretary, doing Star Trek. Desilu was the studio owned by Lucille Ball, and originally Desi Arnaz, but she had divorced him by that time, was married to Gary Morton. Lucy had a show on the lot, but she paid attention to what was going on, and she relied heavily on her 2 senior staffers, the people who were running the studio for her, Oscar Katz and Herb Solow, they liked Star Trek. So she said, okay, let's go. And we were shooting at the Desilu Hollywood lot, basically, which is at the corner of Gower and Melrose, and is now part of the Paramount lot. But it was Desilu separately then, and there was a wall separating it and Paramount with a walkthrough that you could go through. It was a great studio at the time. There were a lot of series there. Bing Crosby Productions had several series there on the lot. And that was my next writing assignment, actually. While we were there on the lot, Gene Roddenberry and I, making the first Star Trek pilot, I said, Ben Casey's on. I like Ben Casey. So I wrote a spec script and put it in, and it was bought. But I had started to get some no's through my agent, scripts written by Dorothy Fontana. So on that spec script, I just put on DC Fontana, and it was bought. And Irving Elman was the producer I was dealing with, and he was surprised to find out that DC Fontana was a woman, but he liked the script, and so he bought it. It was about a man who thought he was a leprechaun, and of course he was dealing with Ben Casey, who had an Irish background, and it was fun. It was Tom Bosley, let me see, Cesar Romero was in it, and Billy Mooney. So I had a great cast for this new start under DC Fontana. When I started speccing scripts for other series, people who didn't know me, my agent came back and said, well, they don't think a woman can write this show. And I said, okay. But when I came to Ben Casey, a show I really, really wanted to write for because I liked the show very much, I put DC Fontana on the script and let them think what they would. Irving Elman never told me he thought it was a guy at first. He just liked the story, he liked the take on it, and he bought it. And when I walked in, he said, oh, okay, fine. You know, again, I was dealing with producers at that time, and I was lucky, who didn't care what gender I was. Did I write a good story? That was all I was ever asked, almost totally throughout my careers. Give me a good story. Can you tell me a good story? And if I did, I got a sale. For the same Bing Crosby company, the following year, when we were doing the second Star Trek pilot, I sold a script to Slattery's People, but it was on assignment as opposed to writing a spec script, because they already knew me now. I had written for Ben Casey. Okay, you can come in and pitch to Slattery's People, which was a Richard Crenna show. And that one did not get made ultimately because the show was canceled. I wrote it and got the credit for it and got paid, but the show was canceled, unfortunately. So I had started now on writing under DC Fontana, and my agent was perfectly happy with that. He would get out and around and about. And along about that time, Molson Company dropped out, and I acquired Alex Brewis as my agent. One-man agent. He and his secretary, Dorothy, did the whole thing. And Alex represented quite a few people, including the gentleman who was in my very first Tall Man script as a guest star, Leonard Nimoy, which is kind of, you know, coming together of people again. I had known Leonard in a friendly way. He was, of course, cast in the first Star Trek pilot and the second Star Trek pilot, and then in the series continually. So Leonard and I have a long relationship going back many, many years to 1960. At the end of the run of The Lieutenant in early 1964, Gene Roddenberry called me into his office one day, and he slid about 12 pages across the desk at me and said, why don't you read that? Tell me what you think. Because he already knew that I was a writer and that I had done other things. And I was up to about 9 sold screenplays at that point, teleplays. And so he knew I was a writer. And he said, I want your opinion. And I said, okay. I went home and I read this thing called Star Trek, which then had, the ship was the Yorktown, and the captain was, let me see, very strange name. It was one of those light names that later was changed first to Captain Pike and then later to Captain Kirk. But I liked that Vulcan first officer. And I said, when I brought the pages back, I said, I really like this. Who's going to play Spock? And Gene slid a picture across the desk at me of Leonard Nimoy, who had been a guest star on The Lieutenant. And I said, I know the guy. It's fine. That's wonderful. So we then started to try and sell it around town, mostly Gene and his agent, obviously. We landed at Desilu, where we began the first pilot, which Gene Roddenberry wrote. It starred John Derek and, of course, Leonard Nimoy. And Susan Oliver as a green dancing girl at one point in the story. Uh, but it came back from NBC. The notes were too cerebral, not enough action for what they felt a science fiction show could be. Remembering at the time that the one science fiction show that was an hour on the air was Outer Limits, and before that, half-hour Twilight Zone. So they were looking for more action. And this time, for the second pilot, Gene Roddenberry hired Samuel A. Peoples, my old boss, and Sam turned in Where No Man Has Gone Before, starring Gary Lockwood and Sally Kellerman, and that one sold. So in 1966 then, at the beginning of the shooting season, which, well, not even shooting, but buying script season, Gene turned to me and he said, "You've been with me for 2 years on this. Pick a story you want to write." And I picked one out of his Bible, where he had listed about a dozen stories, one called Charlie X. So I let Gene have the story credit, and I developed the story, I wrote the script, and it was filmed as I think it was the 8th one on the air. Robert Walker Jr. was the lead. And everybody else was, practically no names, just nice actors. But it was a fun show to do, and I was still behind with the secretary's desk there, answering phones and doing all that stuff. But we were into the season now, and Gene needed scripts. I sold him a second script that was totally my origin. And then he came to me. We had been through John D.F. Black as the story editor, who left to do a movie, then Stephen Karabatsos, and he was ending his contract term of, I think it was 13 weeks. And Gene Roddenberry turned to me and said, "Okay, I'm going to give you a rewrite. If you can rewrite this script to my satisfaction and to NBC's satisfaction, you can be my story editor, because, as always, you've been there from the beginning and you know the show." So I did that. It was a rewrite of a Theodore Sturgeon script, I believe, as I recall. If not, it was somebody else. Sorry, it's been a while. But it was the one that was called Tomorrow Is Yesterday, that starred Jill Ireland, and a love story for Mr. Spock. And nobody considered that at all. And I did. And that was the big rewrite in that particular script that sold everybody that I could be the story editor on Star Trek, and I started the next week.
How did you feel when you got that chance?
Oh, I loved it. What else am I wasn't going to dance in the street. I went home and danced in my apartment. But, it was like, okay, I'm moving ahead. I'm doing what writers I admire do. And among them were Margaret Arment and Pat Fielder and people like that, who were women writing in the action-adventure genre. Most women did not. They were either partnered with a man and were writing comedies or soaps, or a few were writing television, like Margaret Arment and Pat Fielder, and they were writing alone. But there weren't too many of us, so I joined a very elite group of women at that time. I was always forming social connections with writers because I was behind the desk when they came in and turned in their scripts, and I had to type up their notes or sit in the meeting with Roddenberry or whoever else was in the room. And at one time it was Gene Kuhn as well, who was excellent man. I love Gene Kuhn. We, kind of worked with writers a lot. And I got to be friendly with a lot of them. Most of them just went about their business. Others were much more friendly. Margaret Arment was one of them. They were great people. And my being also a member of the Writers Guild and writing Star Trek II gave me a little bit more entree to them. They were more open with me, I think, because they knew who I was in terms of being a guild member and being a writer. It was roughly October of 1966 when I became story editor of Star Trek, and had my own office. I was no longer doing any secretarial chores, of course. In fact, Gene Roddenberry hired Penny Unger, who was the daughter of Babe Unger, who ran Ziv Studios, for which Roddenberry had written scripts many, many times. So I became a friend to Penny, too, at that time. She was a very nice gal, and we liked hanging out together because I had done her job, and we were still pretty close. But I had my own office upstairs and working with writers, and Gene gave me the right to go ahead and talk to writers, give them notes, I would give the combined notes of everybody there, Gene Kuhn, Gene Roddenberry, myself. But it was working independently with writers as a story editor. I wasn't, no one was looking over my shoulder to see if I was doing it right or anything like that. I was completely independent. I mean, obviously I had to work with the show, but when I was dealing with writers, nobody was sitting in the room with me except that writer. It was a great experience. I gained a lot of confidence. I learned to speak up more because I had to. And it was a growing experience for me as well as a great career experience for me. And I was on the show until the end of the second season, which would have been the end of '68, roughly. You read scripts that are submitted by writers. I also had to read the slush pile of spec scripts and comment on them and or return them to the agent who represented that writer, or we called the writer in on my recommendation because I was the one who read the slush pile. I wrote my own scripts. I worked with writers, giving them notes on their scripts. I would try to get down to the set at least 2 or 3 times a week to see what was going on down there, how everything was ticking along. It was interesting for me because I always tried to get down to the set. And I gained my production education, if you will, by going down to the set, usually on a lunch break or maybe a coffee break, and spend half an hour down there. I talk to the actors. How do you feel about the role? What are you learning from this role? In fact, in the second season of Star Trek, I took our Bible and I went to every one of the running actors, the cast actors, and said, tell me what you've learned after living in this person's skin for a year. And they all gave me interesting notes that were then put into the Bible by me. The most interesting one I always thought was from DeForest Kelley, because I said to him, how about if Dr. McCoy has a son? And he said, I think I'd rather see Dr. McCoy have a daughter. So that went into the Bible. And it was always interesting to me that as a Southern gentleman, he picked having a daughter over having a son in his storyline. We never got to tell that story, I'm afraid, but it was there in the Bible. Some scripts I did have to rewrite after the writer turned in the second draft, because that was as much as we could ask them to do. And then, sometimes it was a light rewrite, sometimes it was a heavy-duty rewrite. Gene Kuhn was doing the same thing. He was the producer on the show. Roddenberry had moved up to executive producer. So there were the three of us, either writing or working with writers or concocting stories for other writers to tell. And it was busy. Roddenberry usually stayed way late. I would usually leave around 6:30 and go home and write, because I couldn't get all that much writing done in the office with all this other stuff going on, production concerns. I was in on casting sessions, etc. So I was included. I was fully welcomed into that circle of producing people, and I learned a lot. I learned a great deal. It was better than going to film school. My husband went to the Roger Corman School of making pictures, and he is an Academy Award-winning visual effects cinematographer, so I'm proud of him. But we learned by doing, both of us. So when we talk about production and even about advising people on other productions, so they come to us for either story help, for me, or my husband for visual effects help, it's always about what did we do at Rogers, what did we do on Star Trek, what did we do on, what was our experience that we can now give to somebody new or someone who needs help in those areas. And I enjoy doing it. I now teach at the American Film Institute and have since 1998. I'm mentoring and teaching a lot of very talented young people who are going to film school. I never did.
When you were a story editor, are there any writers that you worked with then that stuck in your mind, or that are still writing today that you'd like to mention?
A lot of them are not still writing today, except for David Gerrold, who came in the second season and wrote a landmark show. I think it's always voted the second favorite episode of Star Trek, The Trouble with Tribbles. And he was just out of college, USC, and a writing professor there had told him, "You'll never be a writer." So of course, David came out and sold his script right out of college and said, "Yeah, I'm going to be a writer." And he has gone on to do many things, many teleplays, novels. I think he's working on his 45th novel, short stories and so on. And, David is still a close friend of mine, but he's one of the ones who's still around and working. In 1967, roughly February, we had finished shooting the second season of Star Trek. And I told Gene Roddenberry I wanted to move on. Now that I had established myself as a writer, I had a staff position on a show, And I felt that I could earn my way as a writer and not have to go back to the secretarial stuff anymore. He offered me assignments as an outside writer on Star Trek in the third season. And unfortunately, they being NBC, put Star Trek on at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday night. And Roddenberry's comment was the last show that had any audience at 10 o'clock on a Friday night was General Electric Theater. And the reason he said that was he knew our demographic. On Star Trek, it was high school kids, college kids, who usually go to football games on Friday nights and things like that, or dances, young adults, young married couples, young professionals, and they were doing stuff on a Friday night. And at that time, of course, there were no recording devices to show an episode afterward. You just had to see it or you missed it, or maybe you caught it in a rerun. And Gene just removed himself from the premises. He was executive producer, pretty much in name only. He didn't pay much attention to the show. Another producer was called in, and the show didn't do as well in its third season. I wrote one full script, The Enterprise Incident, which was based on the Pueblo incident, which had happened earlier that year, and also 2 stories, and I got myself out of there. I was running like a savage to get away because I didn't like what was going on the show. I didn't feel it was right for the show. And we were in that dead-end spot on Friday night, which I knew doomed the show. Interestingly enough, a couple years later, demographics came in as a study, and they could read the numbers. And NBC realized Star Trek had exactly the demographic they wanted, but they never called it back. Then I went on to writing Westerns again. I wrote Lancer, I wrote Big Valley, I wrote High Chaparral, all Westerns, and had a great time doing it. Lancer was for my old boss, Mr. Samuel A. Peoples. I worked with Lou Morheim on Big Valley, and trying to remember
the High Chaparral.
On the High Chaparral. And I did multiples on most of those. I wrote Bonanza. I did 3 of those. So I was having a good time doing Westerns and just moving right along. And freelance writer at all times, but I was making enough money to pay my rent and buy my food and have a nice life. And so I was just cruising. I was also involved about that time. I got very much involved, pulled in by Cy Salkowitz. Cy Salkowitz was very busy with the Guild. Mm-hmm. And he told me, come on down to some meetings. So you get involved. And I did. I began to get interested in various committees, one of them the Women's Committee at that time. And I think at least one other one that I was busy with. And we had several strikes along in that period of time. So here we go again. 73 was a 3-month strike. Yep.
And tell us about the Women's Committee. Other people who might have been on it, what you were doing?
Oh, golly. The only one I can remember, and I'm pretty sure this is right, I think Maggie Arman was on it, but also Joan Owens, who is now Joan Owens Meyerson, and very active with the Guild. And the Women's Committee was just forming because we were starting to get the idea into our heads that we needed one, that we were way underrepresented in the Guild, and still are. In fact, I believe before a congressional committee, Joyce Perry was in charge of telling that committee that the women in the Guild only accounts for about 10%. The rest is white males at that time. And we decided we needed to get more women involved in the committee, involved in the Guild, and making their presence known. Because if there were only 10% of us, we wanted to have a voice. I had established myself as a single writer, i.e. I never wrote with partners then. And I wrote in the action-adventure genre, which was a strong one. And there weren't many of us. Again, Margaret Arman, Pat Fielder, Joyce Perry then, myself, a few others. But mostly the women were either in comedy, or they were in the soaps, or they wrote with a partner in features. So those of us who were writing alone and writing in a genre that was not heavily populated by women felt that we really, really ought to have a voice for all the women. I mean, the others are getting along okay, and they don't seem to have a lot to complain about, but we feel we should. Not that we were paid less, we couldn't be. Not that we were paid less residuals, we couldn't be. But if there was a toss-up between a man and a woman writer, the guy probably would get it, not us. There were not many female executives or show producers or show staff at that time. I can't remember meeting with one woman during that period of the 60s into the 70s, even into the 80s. I always met with male producers. And that was fine. I had no problem with that. If I told them a story that they liked, they would buy it. And that was their only requirement. Tell me a good story. I can't repeat that often enough, because these were men who just wanted a good story for their show. And if they felt I had one, they'd give me an assignment. The same thing with Margaret Arman.
But your sense was it was hard for women to get through the door.
Yeah, there were fewer of us to try. And when we did, very often, again, on the soaps and the comedies, it was with a male partner. There are not that many of us writing solo, and absolutely, one more time, not that many of us in the action-adventure genre. But we tried. And I was particularly lucky in, I had a great agent, Alex Brewis, who really got out there. He went out to every studio every day of the week. He had his rounds, and he always found out who's buying, who wants what, and he would say, do you want to write for the show? And if I was interested in the show, I would say, get me an appointment, and I would go in and pitch. More often than not, I got the job, which was great. I mean, I guess I was telling good stories, otherwise they weren't buying.
And so you were active were you active in any other way in the guild?
Not at that time, just committees. Just committees. And of course, when we were called out on strike, carry the picket signs and do all that stuff that we were required to do. And sometimes it was even fun. I remember marching outside the Disney studios and at the old Disney studios, and they were not very happy with us because we walked entirely around the studio in Burbank.
What year, what do you remember about the 73 strike?
It was only 3 months. And it got a raise. One of the big things then was in television, the writers of half hours and hours had not gotten a raise for more than 10 years. They're still writing at $2,500 and $3,500. So the big thing was to get more money, which we did. I think it went up to $5,000 and $3,000 in that strike. And then, of course, the price has been climbing ever since, which is amazing because now I think an hour minimum payment is something like $35,000 plus residuals, which is mind-boggling.
And did you? There were people who were working during '73 because of the independents signing contracts. Did you manage to land any work, or were you?
No, I was not in with those particular people. They either were doing shows I didn't want to do, or they didn't know me, and I wasn't interested. So mostly I was just doing all the Writers Guild strike stuff, carrying a picket, doing the marching, doing whatever we needed to do, man telephones in the office or whatever. I was happy to do it.
Okay, so then after that, now tell me again, when did you go on the board? First time?
1988.
88, okay, so.
And it was after that strike.
Yeah, that's right, wrong strike. Okay, so continue then. In '73 you were doing, you did a Star Trek?
The Star Trek animated series got rolling, and I could write on that because the animation writers don't come under our contract for the most part, and certainly not then. So we could write a script for an animated series, and I got Star Trek stalwarts, Margaret Arman and David Gerrold and Steve Kandel and people like that, Sam Peoples, to do scripts for the Star Trek animated series, which was done at Filmation in Encino, I think it is. Which was a new experience for me. I was named associate producer. I was the story person on the job all the time. Roddenberry would read scripts at home and he'd occasionally drop by. But mostly I was the one on the floor talking to the writers, helping develop stories and getting them, ooched into delivering them. But they were half hours, so it was a little different from what most of those writers were used to doing. We got a few of the animation writers, Chuck Menville, I think, and a couple of others, but most of them were writers who had written Star Trek, which was why the Star Trek animated series was popular. It's old-time animation now, but the stories were all Star Trek. We weren't just doing a cartoon show. We were doing Star Trek in animation. And I think that we got the voices of almost all the actors. I think Walter Koenig was the only one who was not a voice on the show, and we gave him a script assignment. So we made it as authentic as possible in the environment that it was, a half-hour animation. And in the, let me see, it was 1975, I believe, it won Best Children's Show Emmy. First Emmy that Star Trek ever got. The Star Trek fans have always been smart. They've always been interactive. That is, the first show we had on the air in 1966 in the fall, we got a bag full of mail after that show was on the air. And then the second week we got 3 bags full of mail. And it kept building until there was no way our mailroom could handle it, or anybody at the studio. It had to be farmed out to professional people who would supply the signed photographs and things like that. And personal letters, or especially interesting letters, came to the office, and we dealt with them. But they've always been there. They've always been active. And I have to tell you, the first day after we were on the air, because at that time the first show was 7:30 on Thursday night, if I recall correctly. And the next day, I was in the office, still a secretary at the time, and the phone rang at approximately 9:15. I picked it up and answered, and I heard a very familiar voice say, "This is Leslie Nielsen. May I talk to Mr. Roddenberry?" And I mean, my God, from Forbidden Planet? Are you kidding? I nearly had a heart attack. And I had to say, "I'm sorry, Mr. Roddenberry isn't here, but if I may have your number, I would be happy to have him call you back." And he said, "Well, I just wanted, that's nice, and I'd like to hear from him, but I just wanted to let you all know that it was a really good show and I enjoyed it." It's like, oh my God, what an endorsement. We never played that, but we knew it, that there were people out there who had done science fiction, I mean massively impressive science fiction, who were watching our show too, in addition to those kids in high school and college, and the early occupations, the young adults in their white collar and blue collar positions. They wrote to us, they let us know. It was marvelous.
So you had intelligent viewers.
Mm-hmm. Who were vocal.
Yes, and from a writer's perspective, what were you doing to attract intelligent viewers?
Writing intelligent stories. I'm sorry, that's what we did on Star Trek. We weren't going to write science fiction trash. We had usually strong women most of the time. We had really good actors who were involved in good stories. We got the best writers we could. We made the best scripts we could. People said, "Did you know you were building a legend?" Who? No, of course not. We were just trying to do a darn good show. And that's what we did all the time. You occasionally get one that didn't work as well as others, but we had a lot of really good shows. And we kept it up for 3 years. After that Friday night slot was killing us, and NBC said goodbye. But I do remember at the end of the second season, I'm pretty sure this is right, yeah, Lyndon B. Johnson came on the air, made an announcement that he was not going to seek office, he was not going to run, etc. And then as soon as that announcement went off the air, and a voiceover announcement came on saying, "Star Trek will return next year," which means please don't send us any more of those damn letters. Because when Star Trek was threatened with cancellation at the end of the first season, we got more mail than ever. Not we, NBC got more mail than ever saying, "Don't do this." And there was a march on NBC from college students, from Cal Poly, in fact. They marched through the NBC parking lot slapping stickers of "Save Star Trek" on every car they could find. That we didn't do that. Those people, the fans, did that. So we had a wonderful, wonderful audience, and still do. In terms of the Star Trek animation, when we were prepping it, I heard, "Oh, Star Trek, cartoon, ugh, ugh, ugh." So I said, "Okay, I'm going to the World Science Fiction Convention in Toronto. Is there anything I can take with me?" All they had, this is Filmation who was producing it, was the opening credits, the famous opening credits, same with flyby, Kirk's voiceover, etc. I've got 2 minutes to run. This is it. So at a midnight show, packed audience, and everybody's sort of sneering still, I said, "This is what we have, but I promise you there will be Star Trek stories." And they ran that. People were on their feet screaming and cheering. Just the credits in animation. That's the kind of fans we have, and still have. I did do a lot of Westerns. I enjoyed working on Big Valley. Mm-hmm. Not only because it was Lou Morheim, who was wonderful, and he has the same birthday that I do, except not the year. And Lou was always generous and gracious, but the first one I wrote for them, which was a journey story for Barbara Stanwyck. And I had watched the show, but when I turned in my script and first draft, and Barbara read it, she said, "Hey, I'm Ruby Stevens from Brooklyn. I don't talk like this." Okay, so I went back and I watched a few more Big Valleys, and I tuned up the dialogue for her. And after that, she had no problems. I did a second one for Barbara as well, but it involved more of the family. But it was a wonderful show to write for, because you had such professionals on the stage that you never had to worry about your work. You know, once you turned it in, you knew it was in good hands. So that was always a great show to work for. Let me see, Streets of San Francisco, I did 4 of those. And the first one I did, I went in and worked for Bill Yates and John Wilder. John was producer, Bill was an associate producer or story editor at the time. And then the other 3 that I did were for Bill, because John had moved on. But it was, again, it was a wonderful experience. You were working with professionals. You knew once you turned it over to Carl Malden and Michael Douglas, it was in good hands, no problems. But I did have to do one bad thing to Michael Douglas. In the second script I wrote, called Solitaire, I had to have Carl Malden working alone. So I had to get rid of Michael Douglas somehow. And what I did was I had him have an accident whereby he's chasing an intruder or a thief or a killer, forget now, through the San Francisco Zoo, and he actually slips and falls into the lion cage and breaks a leg. So since he was going to be on crutches for the entire episode, I had the opportunity to bring in the guest star of Tony LoBianco, who was at that time very much a rising television star. And he and Carl Malden did the second one pretty much alone, except for a minor appearance by Michael Douglas. And the other 2, of course, involved all the regular actors, Carl and Michael, etc. But they were great shows to write, because if you came in, again, and told a good story, something that intrigued Bill Yates, he was on it. It's just, go home and write it. And that's usually what I heard. It was not, yes, it's go home and write it. And I knew the contract would be in the mail the next week. 9/10 of my stories are about love in one way or another, some form, whether it's familial, whether it's brother, sister, brother, brother, whether it's about physical love between men and women, or men and women. I don't care, as long as it's a love story. A lot of the others that I like to write have a history hook. As I said, I'm a real history buff. I love history, and I'll very often think of one thing that clicks, and that becomes the hook that is the story. I did it on Babylon 5 when I was recalling the fact that T.E. Lawrence, after his service in World War I, where he was so revered and he hated it, he was hiding out, but he was instrumental in creating and building the British lifeboat service, which is where a ship at sea close to shore is in trouble, and the lifeboat service goes out. At that time they rowed out in longboats and helped people get off to be saved from crashing the ship on the rocks or whatever. And I use that idea of people going out to rescue people in a Babylon 5 called A Distant Star, where there was a ship lost in an area of space that they didn't know, and they were literally going ship by spaceship by spaceship by spaceship to reach that ship in trouble. So I hooked it in that way. I've done it also on a Babylon 5 linked into Lincoln's assassination and the long process of moving his body from Washington, D.C. I think it went to Philadelphia, it went to New York, and then it went to Chicago, and then to Springfield, where he's finally buried. And at that time, even the newspapers had minimal coverage of an event like this. I mean, they covered it as best they could, but you didn't have, as you had, for instance, the Kennedy assassination. So people would come out. They couldn't watch it on television. They couldn't hear about it on radio. They came out to see the body and the coffin, etc., and watch as the train went by, etc. So I use that in a Babylon 5, where a great war hero was being transported home, and his stop at the Babylon 5 space station was, his body was snatched. Who did it? Who would do that? As you may know, Lincoln's body was almost stolen about 12 years after he was buried in Springfield for the first time. Later they built a great crypt that you can't drop an atomic bomb on and harm. But because of that, I started thinking, what can I make out of this, and what kind of complication for the manager of the space station would having this great hero's body stolen provide for him? So it was great. I mean, I like to do stuff like that. In fact, there was an article on Babylon 5 where Larry DiTilio and Joe Straczynski were talking. They were the producer and story editor on the show. And Larry pointed out that I like to do that hook and can make it work even in a science fiction venue. So I guess that's one of my tricks. On Dallas, I had already worked for Leonard Katzman on 2 shows, Fantastic Journey and Logan's Run, and I was his story editor. So I knew Leonard, who then went on to Dallas, and he called me in on it was actually a mass meeting of writers all sitting around. This is after they had done 6 episodes, and now they needed writers for a continuing series that was going to go for many, many years. And everybody was sitting around, I think it was a Monday, and they were pitching their ideas, and Leonard finally came around to me. He said, "Dorothy," I said, "Well, I can't help thinking about the tragedy that happened over the weekend when Bruce Geller, who was the creator and producer of Mission Impossible, was killed in a private plane crash around Santa Barbara." I said, and I knew Bruce and I loved him. He was a really nice guy. I worked for him once, not as a writer, as a secretary. But it really pained me to know that he was gone. And so I pitched an idea whereby the 2 then existing guys that we knew who were the sons, Larry Hagman and Patrick Duffy, suppose they're on a private plane flight. The plane goes down and nobody knows where they are and they can't get a signal out. No cell phones then, remember? So he said, "Go home and write it." And actually my brother and I decided to do that together. We started to work together. It was my older brother, Richard, who is 6 years younger than I am. And the 2 of us were working on that. And we did a second Dallas. And the second time we came in, we were waiting in the office. And Luella Carraway, who I knew because she was Leonard Katzman's secretary forever, said, "God, they're in there a long time. It was like an hour meeting." And, and my brother and I went in, talked to Leonard, I think it was pitching a story, second story. And then we walked out and Luella said, 15 minutes, what's that? I said, "We're the pros from Dover." So, I mean, we were always efficient. I was always efficient. It never took me that long to sell a story unless it wasn't going to really sell. And I knew if this is going on, I'm not going to sell this. When I go in to pitch a story, I know my story. I don't have to write it down, but I have gone over it and gone over it and gone over it and gone over it. I know all the high points and I can answer most questions about it. I don't like to bring in something written and I don't usually need notes. So my thing is prepare, 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 prepare. And never bring your agent. This is a story going back to Logan's Run now. Leonard Katzman was in the office, I was in the office, and a writer who was a well-known science fiction writer came in. He had brought his agent. Okay, not usual, but all right. So we're sitting there listening to the writer's pitch, and I'm here where Angela is off screen is where my producer was. The writer was opposite me, and the agent was over here on the couch. And as the writer's pitching earnestly, we hear, and the poor writer was embarrassed because his agent had fallen asleep during his pitch. So never bring your agent. I don't usually go scene for scene. When I'm telling a story, I do hit the high points, but they're the major moments that, what is that moment in this act that propels it into the next act, or is that big high moment in that act that we have to pay attention to. So as I said, I really memorize, I rehearse my pitches, and I know what I'm going to say, and I can usually answer questions unless they're so out of left field they're crazy. But most of the time, it's the ability to tell the story in order, not, oh, I forgot this, and I forgot to tell you this. I usually have it all organized and ready to pitch. And if it's going on too long, if they're a little hesitant, if they're on the verge of saying, well, we have something like that, I know it's not going to be a good meeting. But if I like them and I like the show, I will come back and try at least 1 or 2 more times, because I feel that persistence, it often has a reward. Again, it was like my very first job in New York. I came back 3 times applying for that job. They knew I wanted to be there working for them. So I do the same thing pretty much. If I really like the show, even if I miss on one, I'll come out and do it again, pitch more, because I really want to work for that show. And sometimes you pull something out of your hip pocket just as you're walking out the door. I did that on, let me see, It was the show up in Oregon. Here Come the Brides. Okay, right. On Here Come the Brides, I had pitched a couple of ideas, which they, no, but they went, and I started out the door and I said, wait a minute. I saw a show last night. It was a Laurel and Hardy short. And they weren't Laurel and Hardy then. They were Oliver Hardy and Stan Laurel working for the first time together. It was a little thing called Putting Pants on Philip. And what it was Stan Laurel was playing a Scotsman who always wore his kilt. And he just couldn't go out in the business world that way here in the United States. So Oliver Hardy had to get him into a pair of pants. And it was hysterical because, of course, he kept pulling down the kilt and, slapping hands away. And when you tried to take an inside leg, forget it. So I said, how about if the brothers in this story have an uncle who is actually the chief of their clan in Scotland? But he's messed it all up back there. He's lost the money, he's lost the estate. Now he's coming here. And in a way, he's begging them to help him, but he's trying to run their lives. And he's messing up a romance, and he's messing up the business. And finally, he sees that he can have a voice, but he's not running the company. It's their company now. It's their time. And they liked that story. And I literally did it out of my hip pocket walking out the door, but based on a Laurel and Hardy comedy. Well, the Waltons was a little easier. Earl Hamner Jr. ran a great show, and he always provided writers with like a paragraphed outline of, just this much, of every story they had done. And I came in with my brother in the 8th season. So we had all that material, knowing, all right, they've already done these stories. What new ones can you come up with? As it happened, the first one they gave us because it was John Boy's return to the family. And that almost told itself. He had been in New York, I think, working on a newspaper or something like that, as I recall, and he came home. And now that homecoming was a big moment for the entire family. So it almost wrote itself simply because of that. But we also had all this other material we knew they had done, and we could pick a few things to refer to bounce off, and make that story work. And then we came back and we did 3 more. But those were our stories. We did one called The Starlet, which was about one of the girls going to Hollywood and trying to make her way here, and how the family had to help her. And another one was, that show was done during Prohibition. And we found out that there is a way actually to make moonshine that will run a car. Gas was horrendously expensive. So they were making their own gas. And all the family troubles that came out of that. So we were having a good time with them, but they were always helpful. They would supply any information. Like if you didn't see the rest of this season, because you're kind of busy as writers, here's what we're doing this year. They gave us all kinds of information, and any kind of question we had, they answered. Earl Hamner Jr. is a star in my mind because he is just such a great producer and writer. Well, we'd watched the show for years, so we knew the characters, really. Even a few new ones that had come in, we were able to insert as needed, or as the show demanded. Sometimes you say you have to have this character in there, and then you have to find a place to put them in, even though they're not a part of your major story. You can always find a subplot to move people in. And that's another big change now from when I was doing most of my writing. I still write, but now I'm noticing, especially since I'm teaching at the American Film Institute, and I teach the 1-hour TV drama, so I have to know this, most hour shows are now 46 minutes, 41 minutes, depending on what network they're on. And when I was starting with Star Trek, we had 54 minutes of storytelling time. That's an entire act gone that you no longer have to tell a story. Also, you have many shows that do the teaser and 5 acts, where the traditional CSIs, Law and Orders, usually do teaser and 4 acts. But a whole lot of shows are doing the teaser and 5 acts, which makes a very choppy structure. It's harder to write now. It really is. Again, unless you're writing for those few shows that do the traditional teaser and 4. So you have less storytelling time, and you have to do it in bigger, I should say smaller chunks, because of more breaks. Well, I think in preparing for any show, you better know the show. You cannot walk in cold and just tell them a story. You have to know the characters. You have to know their character story lines, their arcs, because there are a lot of them today. You didn't used to have to do that from show to show to show, episode to episode, but you do now, because there are very strong subplot, personal stories running in almost every series. And you have to pay attention to that as a writer. Where are your characters in their relationships and whatever their trouble is? On CSI, I think in about the third season, they had a whole arc about Grissom having a hearing loss because it was congenital in his family. And he was having to deal with that. And how is he going to proceed professionally if he could not hear? So that was a running story for, I think, 4 or 5 episodes in that particular year of CSI. And they paid it off. They did it. But you had to know about that. You had to watch the show to know that that was a particular problem of his. And you have to do that with any show. If you're not watching the show, you're in trouble. Because what are you trying to write then? If it's not on the air, if it's a show that's prepping, which is always hard, then you have to get as much information from the producers as possible. What stories are you doing? How are the other writers working these characters so that you know? Today, in the room, as they say, the writer's room, many stories are broken in the room. I've been through that experience where the story is outlined on the board, on little 3x5 cards, or on a whiteboard, whatever, and it's broken down so you know what the story is going to be, at least in broadest strokes, not specifically scene by scene by scene, but in big broad strokes. This has to happen in Act 1, this has to happen in Act 2, and these 3 things happen to happen in Act 3, etc. So producers are usually good about that. But now the stories are broken in the room, and the writers in the room might be assigned the story and teleplay. It's different from when you're coming in as a freelance writer, and there are very few freelance writers today, unfortunately. My experience has always been writing with just a couple of people at the top, and you're a freelance writer working with the story editor or the producer, and you go home and write it. It's not the same as it is today, although I did work as late as 1996 on Lonesome Dove, where it was done in Canada, but there were only 2 people in the room, Rick Drew and Alison Hawke, whom I've worked with before. She's an old friend. And they had me come up to Canada, to Calgary, and put me up for several days, and they took me out to the sets, and they walked me through what they were doing. And, because it was now the Lonesome Dove, I think it's called The Later Years. And so it's not the cattle drive story, it's in that town. And it was a wonderful experience. But again, I was only working with 2 people. I only had to please 2 people. I told them a story, we worked out a story, and it was great. And I threw in one of America's serial killers as the heavy in the story. I think she was known as the Pig Woman. I forget her actual name. But she killed people and fed them to her pigs and travelers, and confiscated their money. So what I did was I took the serial killer and put her in, again a woman, with an inn at the roadside, where she literally killed people and took their money and buried them by feeding them to the pigs. So that was part of, again, my using history to find a story hook and something obviously that your hero now had to get out of, escape and thwart her and turn her over to the local sheriff or whatever and solve the story. So this is what I do. It's maybe a crazy way of working, but I love to do it. My husband is Dennis Skotak. He is a visual effects cinematographer. He's won an Oscar for The Abyss and also was nominated for Batman Returns. And we met over an alien backbone. And I say all that to people and they fall off the chair laughing. We were doing a Halloween show for an old friend. I had done many of these shows over the years. It was like a backyard show or a front yard show. And we always based it on some famous science fiction movie. This particular one was Alien. And we were working on the alien backbone for the costume that one of our people had to wear. And we just kind of struck up a relationship, and we really liked each other, and we've been now married 31 years in October. But the alien backbone story usually gets people, what? and the interesting thing is, that was 1979, so 6 years later, he was doing visual effects on Aliens for Jim Cameron. So it's one of those things where history tends to repeat itself in our lives. I was on the board 2 terms, not consecutive. There was a year in between. And I ran after the 1988 strike because I felt that there weren't enough women on the board, and I wanted to get in there. I wanted to get into that fight. And so I did win a place on the board, and I enjoyed working on the board. I found that it was different from what I imagined it would be from having come in occasionally to present a suggestion, usually for a committee of some kind or another, or to report on a committee that I happen to be chairing or a big part of. So I only knew the board in that way, and I knew a few people on the board. I knew Del Reisman, and several others that I can think of right now. I believe John Wells ran with me that year. If not, it was the second time I ran. But I began to know a lot more people who are higher up in the guild, but also working writers, because that's what the board is. And I had a good time. I felt we accomplished some things that were important and necessary. And then I had to take a year off because, as I said, my husband was potentially going to be doing a film in Russia. And I said, if you're going to Russia, I'm going to Russia. And it happened, that didn't turn out, but I then went for the board the next year and was elected for a second term. But it was always a good working relationship. I admired what the board did. Most of our time was never wasted. It was put to good use. I never saw a lot of, thumb twisting as, let's get this over with. It was always, we're here to work, we're here to do a job. And I respect our board for that, because I feel they do. Once they're elected, they do the job, which is run this guild. And without committees, without the volunteers, there would be no guild. The staff cannot do it all alone. And that's where the writer contribution comes in, working on a committee. It doesn't take that much time. We do occasionally get fed. And I was running out the door one time for another committee meeting. My husband called after me, "You don't get paid for this, do you?" And I said, "No, but we do get dinner." The 1988 strike, I think, was a very important strike for us. It had a lot of things up in the contract that we needed to have taken care of. Again, it had been a gap of time, contracts being upped and all that little bit of thing, the bottom raised on our minimums and so on. But there were a lot of questions in the 88 strike that a lot of people were very, very concerned with. And that's why I think you had huge participation from everybody who could walk or crawl and carry a picket sign. And it did go on for a long time. I think 88 was our longest strike, if memory serves. And I was out there on the picket lines then, and it was always amazing to me that so many people would turn out, and you'd see faces you hadn't seen in years. Somebody who wrote on the first Star Trek is carrying a picket sign. "Hi, Paul, how are you? Hi, Joe," that kind of thing. And we don't, as writers, stay in touch with a lot of people we know. We tend to be solitary creatures, unfortunately, except for maybe the spouse and the family. And when you see people out on the strike lines, it's almost like old home week. So there's another reason for going out. It's just to see people you haven't seen in 10 years. But it was an important strike, even though it was a long strike. I did feel that it was a necessary strike, and I usually don't. But that one was a necessary strike, and we got a lot of things in that contract that I felt were important. I also met Paul Naraki for the first time and worked closely with him on several things when I was on committees, etc. And he was still with the guild. And I like Paul a lot. He was always very kind to me, and if I had a problem, he always knew where I could post the query or talk to this person or that person. And I'm probably responsible for getting those green envelopes, that we get our residuals in, the kind that fold over and seal. Because if you remember, we used to get them, they had a tear-off end, and they were kind of thin and flimsy. Well, one day I went to my mailbox and pulled out one of those, and 3 checks were half hanging out of it. And I took it just that way into Paul and said, "Look, if I didn't have an honest postman, these could have been lost easily." And I would never know, because at that time we didn't have a residual tracking system like we do now. You can go on the website and see what you might have coming in, etc. So I left it with Paul. I took my checks, but I left the envelope with Paul to show. And pretty soon after that, we started getting those green envelopes that fold over and seal. So that's my big contribution, they say.
It's a really important one. Do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Right. That's the only way I know how to really do this job. You can listen to all the people talk. You can listen to experts tell you how to do it. You can read books. But you have to write. You have to put the words on the page. You're the one who has to tell the story. If you cannot do that, don't be a writer. I know people who have struggled, and they struggle with every story, and they're not terribly good writers. Most of the people I know who are good writers write fairly easily. They got the idea, now I have to develop it, and you get it down on the page. And you can run into a bump now and again. You raise your head in the middle of the 3rd act and say, how am I going to get to the 4th act? And what I do, I tell my writing students, and I tell other people who ask yourself, what are the big moments I have to have in this story to tell it? And sometimes, okay, you can jump right to that. And then once you've got that script, that scene written, you know what should come before it. You know what should lead into it. So writing those blocks helps people get over the bumps when I don't know where I'm going, I don't know what I'm trying to do. What scenes do I absolutely have to have? Absolutely. And then they can find their way. A good writer can find their way. I write a lot. I write by hand first draft. I love my yellow pads. But then as I'm typing it now into the computer, it's easy to change if I, come up with a better line of dialogue or a better scene sequence, like move them around and all that good stuff. But that's my second draft. Then I print it out because I like to look at the page. I hate looking at a screen. And I do it all again. I read it through. I edit it. I add things. I take things out. And then I go back to the computer and put it in all again. So my producers are usually getting third or fourth drafts. But that's how I work. Other people can sit down and just type it into the machine and they're fine. I can't do that. Except under absolute pressure, I have done it once or twice on a series when we had to have that teleplay tomorrow morning, and I would sit down and do it. I hate doing it because I don't like writing that way. I would rather have the time to ponder the scene as I'm handwriting and doing all that little stuff. That works for me, but again, I grew up in the era when the biggest advance in typewriters was electric. So the greatest thing that happened was computers. I got my first one in 1983, and I haven't stopped using a computer since. But I still do that original first work by hand on a yellow pad.